Remain calm. Rebecca Solnit is here.
If I make goofy faces, it's because my nephews are in the audience, and they're very cute. That's the main reason, anyway.
I don't have any excuses for why I make goofy faces. I have some boilerplate to start off with. I want to start by saying thanks for coming out for the book festival. Isn't it awesome to have a book festival in the Bay Area? Turn off your cell phones. Like off. Thank you. And Rebecca's books, and maybe mine, I don't know, will be out in the lobby, available for sale. And she'll be signing books as well after we're done talking. And I don't know if all of them will be out there, but so the description, just so you know you're in the right place. Rebecca Solnit in conversation with myself. My name is Christian Frock. So, oh, thank you. Mom? She's out of town, so I don't know. Solnit writes on topics from art to eviction, geography to feminism, environment to politics, all with impeccable, gorgeous prose. She is a Bay Area treasure, and I absolutely agree with that. And we're going to be freewheeling. That's how we decided to approach this conversation. So it could get crazy.
Watch out.
Well, on the heels of promising to freewheel, I'm going to take out my notes. Rebecca is just back from New York, working on your New York Atlas.
Third and final Atlas. Thank God. So with UC Press, it's kind of lovely being here because, like, I'm going to point in the wrong direction because, like, you turn around in these theaters. Being sandwiched between a public high school and a public university and all this public space, being at a book festival. Steve Wasserman, who organized the LA Festival of Books on which this is modeled, is in the audience. He told me part of what was so great about that festival is that these families, poor families, would come and the kids would be on a college campus for the first time and think, like, I could go here. And, and that's a part of the introduction you didn't do. From kindergarten to graduate school, I'm a product of the California public education system. And I say that because once I was on a panel with Bill McKibben and Eric Schlosser, and they're very nice people, but they're from that other coast. And Eric, and they're like older than me, which is really, really, really old. And Eric was introduced as a graduate of Princeton, and Bill as the editor of the Harvard Crimson. And I realized, like, we don't name drop our universities on the West Coast, but that also we don't, like, we need to boast about, well, although sometimes I think when I say that I came all the way up through public school in California, maybe it'll make people want to defund them more. But I like to bring it up. And yeah, I'm just back from New York. It's really different there. It's a foreign country. Our mom was from there. She was an emigre to California who is definitely not going back. And it's an amazing, amazing place. Then, like, there's just stuff like more people come through Grand Central Station every work day than live in Seattle. And, there's kind of great pulsing, throbbing metropolis. There's Queens has more language diversity and density than any place else in the world. And it's not only like a lot of big languages that you might have heard of, but it's like some of the last speakers of some of the rarest languages in the Americas and Asia live in Queens. These people were like they're one of the last 17 speakers and things. We have a map of that coming out, incidentally, called Queens in Mother Tongues.
Yeah, so I also have noticed you've been sort of mining social media to get input from people, lots of different feedback about the content for the atlases. How do you filter that?
You take what you want and then you duck when people try to stick you with things that you don't. And atlases are sort of fun because everybody's really interested in the subjects, and people occasionally get very tendentious about how you should do it and how they should be part of it, and which is lovely and great. But we're managing about 40 people, and that's enough. for somebody who normally manages like one.
Jumping over a little bit then to the West Coast, talk about our growing metropolis and the changes in San Francisco, which has been a big subject of your work.
Oh my God, I keep meaning to write a piece about San Francisco called "Welcome to Fratistan," and
You don't
I
know what she
that-
means?
And it's like it's like this shove. Silicon Valley's shoving San Francisco, which is shoving Oakland, which is sort of, and it's this thing where, like, I know all these San Franciscans are moving to Oakland. Where are all the Oaklanders being displaced going? Antioch? But it happened during the dot-com boom, too, this sort of systemic displacement where the rich displace the upper middle class, who displace the middle class, and it goes on until poor people get pushed out of the poor parts of the inner Bay Area to the outer Bay Area. It's also part of the great reversal. The post-war era white flight meant rich people didn't want to live in cities, and that was always discussed as though that was a bad thing. In a way, it kind of left cities to immigrants, people of color, poor people, and bohemians, and it made cities really rich, interesting places. And now rich people want cities, and they can have whatever they want because they're rich. That's what that means, actually. And so, like, Manhattan is already kind of a dead zone culturally. Somebody described it as being like Dubai with blizzards. And in the New York Times, that wasn't me. And, and it's interesting looking at how culture kind of, because there's patronage, like the Koch brothers give money to the New York City Opera, but like a lot of the rest of the art withers, the poor, the art that doesn't come with elite patronage. And it's interesting seeing cities become these kind of like dense suburban places. And you look at Soho in New York, which I was walking through, I think that would be yesterday, maybe it'd be the day before. And, it used to be a place where immigrant Jewish garment workers worked in sweatshops making garments, and then it was abandoned and Robert Moses wanted to tear it down. And then a bunch of artists, including my friend Lucy Lepard, moved in there surreptitiously in the 60s when it was sort of a dead zone. This is before, they sort of invented all that loft living stuff. It's not that, they weren't following a trend, they were accidentally inventing one. And then they had like 20 pretty good years, and then everybody else, like lawyers and doctors and rich people and real estate magnates, wanted to live in Soho. And gradually it looks exactly like a shopping mall on the ground floor. They've got French Connection and Coach and all these kind of slightly upscale but really super shopping mall. It's like the Stanford shopping mall with, the sort of haunted by the ghosts of garment workers who are now, of course, all in China. And you see this sort of emptying out. And it's happening in Silicon Valley. And there's two things that freak me out about Silicon Valley, though, one of which is what they're doing to San Francisco specifically, and that it's not just an incursion of people, but it's an incursion of people who are elite technocrats, mostly white men, who seem antithetical to a lot of the more inclusive, idealistic, democratic visions that the Bay Area at its best has been about. The other thing is that the technologies they're inventing, make George Orwell look like he was writing stories about puppies and kittens for children. And when Big Brother was watching you, he had it was not like big hipster brother Google, who's tracking every web page you look at and is trying to get you to use Gmail and the maps and Google Docs and stuff like that, so they can track everything you do, not just some of what you do, like Apple and Microsoft and things like that. So that it's also, I should probably move along, and it's also that I think what made the Bay Area great is that, and I learned this, it's funny working on this LA thing, is that New York has always been very proud of being the center of the universe, and they're not very shy about explaining that they're that to you every once in a while, like 5 minutes or so. And, and centrality is an interesting thing, but I actually think being margins is more interesting. Margins are where things sneakily develop, and we're literally the edge, and, the Pacific Coast is the far edge of Western civilization. After that, it's a long ways, and then you're not in the Western civilization, you're in Asia. And we've become the global center in some ways. And to go from an edge to a center, for me, economically is supposed to be a victory, although it's a kind of wealth that produces poverty as a huge byproduct. But it's also destroying the edginess that we had, and that's what really concerns me, then I don't know what this place will be, although I know some of it's a bubble that will pop. Not soon and hard enough for most of you, I'm sure. How many of you work in Silicon Valley? Or should I not ask questions like that? Did I just make that sound worse than masturbating in public? Or joining the Third Reich, or what? I don't know. Maybe it's a combination.
I don't know where to go with that.
You're damned whichever way you go.
I mean, there are some things that are redemptive about technology. I think it's actually how we became friends. I think we became friends on Facebook.
But if we weren't spending so much time on Facebook, would we have met in person? Because that's the thing, like where else, like, you know, like in the days when people only meet each other on Tinder and Facebook and or just yell at each other and send rape and death threats on Twitter. I mean, like, how many of you send rape threats on Twitter daily? Because, like, just to sort of riff on what you're saying, don't you think Twitter is the most amazing way the world has ever seen to send anonymous rape and death threats? How many of you are on Twitter? How many of you have no idea how to go on Twitter? I feel like we have a very balanced audience here.
I always ask my students at the beginning of every semester what social media they're using, and this semester none of my classes were using Twitter or Facebook. They're only using Instagram. How many of you use Instagram? That's the future. I immediately started trying to learn it. It's harder than it looks.
It's kind of great because you have to actually make an image, which means that you actually have to be present in some way and maybe aesthetic. You know, you can't just upload somebody else's, I guess you can upload somebody else's kitten picture, but you're supposed to make your own kitten picture.
There's something about it that feels apolitical to me.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's a kind of a distillation down from Facebook to Twitter, where you only get 140 characters, I think it is, down to you don't get to say anything. It's just an image. Do you use Instagram?
No, and I don't use Twitter, partly because of the rape and death threat part, and partly because, as you probably noticed, it's very hard for me to corral myself into 140 characters.
That's okay, right? Yeah, you can live with that. Well, then let's talk about mansplaining, if we're going to talk about Twitter and rape threats. Exactly half of the room applauded. I was noticing on Facebook this week that Teen Vogue had published a primer for teenagers about mansplaining.
Yeah, and it was sort of, and the trajectory of is pretty amazing. And I wrote an essay that went out and then went viral in April of 2008 called Men Explain Things to Me, now the title of my best-selling book. And thank you. And look, men are clapping. It's not like that, Christian.
I saw him.
I saw that.
Yeah.
You're our friend. We like you. You're with the revolution. And then some anonymous woman who I wish would step forward coined the term mansplaining literally the next week. And the word gradually caught on. It became the New York Times Word of the Year in 2010. It entered the Oxford English Dictionary in 2012 or 2013. And now it's crossed the final frontier, which is Teen Vogue. And, but no, it's kind of great, because like Teen Vogue isn't necessarily the greatest fomenter of revolution. And there's this is the most, you know, I was hanging out with Susan Griffin earlier today, who was part of that incredible feminist explosion in the late 60s and early 70s. And, you know, and to paraphrase, is it Milton, we are fashionistas standing on the shoulders of giants? And who said that? Come on, we're in Berkeley. Who said Newton? Okay. And I love a smart audience. And but this is the most exciting feminist era of my lifetime, because I was like busy playing with plastic horses and not Barbie dolls during that other efflorescence. And you know, and it's interesting seeing these ideas come to new places. I want, like, Teen Vogue is great, but what I'm really excited about is Amy Schumer. Mm-hmm. And that Saturday Night Lights parody she did was like the most outrageous thing imaginable. And it's like, what? This is on television? This is on, because this is the kind of stuff that like in another period it would be like some little cult indie, obscure, whatever. But like this woman's like making scathingly hilarious radical feminist attacks on patriarchy and all its assumptions and privileges and et cetera, and making it in a way that's incredibly hilarious. How many of you saw that skit? Wow. Well,
can we talk a little bit about how, aside from the writing, how you contend with feedback online from trolls and the sort of dogpiling? I know that the year before last, when you published the first piece in the London Review of Books, the diary piece about changing San Francisco, there was actually articles written that argued with you, which you then argued with in Guernica.
I took down one that was in Grist, but mostly the best thing, what's interesting in this era, and technology has done good things for us, but we have we've all been taken over by Silicon Valley. We already know that, and we hear about it and think different and all that magic stuff, and we've been blitzed by it for 25 years. So, rounding out the story, I think, is important. That 25 years ago, people used to like cuss at their TVs, and the only people who heard them were the other people in the room with them. Now they do exactly the same thing with exactly the same amount of insight and spiritual generosity. Only it's called Twitter or something, and it's weird. And then people seize on it as though it's meaningful. And I remember like some adorable little Latino boy sang the national anthem at a baseball game in Texas, and then all these stupid people tweeted incredibly racist, offensive things, partly based on the idea that all Latinos just got here last week, which means that they all had lobotomies, the people who tweeted those things. But it's like, that stuff is just out there, and you sort of have to ignore it. Like, I've gotten much better at not reading comment sections. Sometimes you want to set something right, and when it's with that, it was less that people were criticizing me. Like, the guy in Grist was arguing that the Google bus is this awesome form of public transit, and that why are we against carpooling, which is a beautiful ecological thing, and he's like this idiot in Brooklyn who didn't know anything about anything. Like that actually, a lot of people wouldn't live in San Francisco if it wasn't for the Google bus, and that it's privatized transit, and what it does is it pushes, the car mechanic gets evicted from San Francisco, and like no magic bus comes and picks him up in Vallejo and drives him to his job in San Francisco, and so like, it was really about defending the Bay Area. And it's also been really funny being in New York, because like a lot of you have heard that about the magic of like, well, if we just densified, if we just had more density, like everything would be magic, and puppies would have free rent, and the world would be a beautiful place, and none of you would be anxious about housing. And it's like, excuse me, but the only place denser than San Francisco is New York, which is not famous for its lack of housing problems and its massive affordability. So the whole idea that we'll just build it and, everything will be beautiful. And all we're building in San Francisco now is luxury housing and a tiny bit of mandated affordable housing, which is not affordable to, it exists for people who make like $70,000 a year, which is not being poor, or something like these weird little narrow slots of who can afford it.
Yeah, I interviewed Yolanda Lopez, the pioneering Chicana arts leader in San Francisco, last year, and she said in my piece that she couldn't afford affordable housing because she lives on Social Security and doesn't make enough money. And so there are these built-in contradictions to who affordable housing is even for in the city.
It's for sort of middle class housing, because it's non-super rich housing. Mm-hmm. But it's not, affordable is such a weird misnomer.
Do you think there's anything changing at all with the recent measures in the city to try to slow it down?
They didn't pass. There was a measure introduced. I know we're talking, how many of you live in Berkeley? Wow.
We could talk about the percent for art program.
How many of you live in Oakland? How many of you live in San Francisco? Okay, like we have a scale from like 60%, 30%, 10%.
That's right. We'll talk later.
Wait, where do you live?
San Leandro, the real East Bay.
Yeah. Well, I am from Novato. Does that make me more okay? Just speaking of really cool parts of the Bay Area. where were we? Oh, yes.
We were just
it
talking
has
about whether any of the, I mean, there are all kinds of
Yeah.
examples that, like, even I know in Berkeley right now that there's a big discussion about a percent for art program, right? That is based on development, which is another way of privatizing public art, which is something that I think about a lot. In San Francisco, there's just been the announcement that the city is going to be releasing $7 million in funds to arts organizations. There are small things in terms of advancing in face of the rising costs. I'm just wondering if you see any good in that, or if it's more of a Band-Aid.
What really worries me is that a lot of the models we get are basically charity models, where it's like rich people will be nice to artists and poor people and stuff like that. And that's not a working model. That's sort of like, you know, it's dependent on rich people being nice, which is not a stable system. And, you know, and I think it's great. Or we're all supposed to have this kind of circular thing where, like, we all give stuff to each other's projects on Kickstarter. Well, Kickstarter, speaking of how much I love Silicon Valley, takes a really surprisingly large chunk. And what is it that Kickstarter takes? It's like
5%? 9.
9%. Like, that's insane. You raise $100,000 for a movie and they walk off with $9,000 for having software. And so, like, Kickstarter is basically an incredible fundraiser for Kickstarter. And, you know, and so just the whole system of either people being able to afford their lives and work and to make a living doing what they do, and that includes teaching school and being nurses and doing all the other meaningful stuff, driving trucks and school buses and things, you know, and this whole idea that it's all, I don't know. And we're returning to a 19th century model of an insanely rich kind of landed gentry and a bunch, you know, Dickensian starving masses. And what people don't remember, speaking of lobotomies and amnesia, is that the reason that all that changed mostly is because workers rose up and organized and et cetera. David Graeber made this amazing remark. He's one of the great geniuses of our time, David Graeber, who wrote that the Russian Revolution was incredibly successful, especially outside Russia. And what he meant is that the revolution so terrified a lot of the powerful people in Europe and North America that they made huge concessions to workers. And we got the 40-hour work week and, you know, various kinds of social safety nets. Some of you probably remember free public education and funded, and California when it had the best public educational system in the world, and Berkeley and the whole Cal system was free and stuff like that. And we hadn't really, and people forgot that. But the reason, part of why we had that is because we demanded it. Another reason we had it is because they were terrified we were going to revolt, so they had to give us things. And now they've decided to take everything away. And I think that, you know, you see with Occupy and Strike Debt, we're in the fight around minimum wage, which has been extraordinary. We're in a very insurrectionary time. And, you know, this isn't this is not the revolution with the guillotines and et cetera. And so maybe we could do a Kickstarter for a guillotine. But it is this, people's, and that was one of the things that was so moving about Occupy, was that all these people came out and testified, and poverty is supposed to be shameful, and people shut up and disappear. You lose your job and you disappear from your workspace and the commute and all the things you could afford to go to when you had a job. You lose your home and you disappear further and stuff. And all these people stood up and talked about it and really made it clear how many people are barely getting by or not getting by at all, how desperate the huge numbers of people are, how destroyed by the debt industry and stuff. And so I feel like we've returned to the 19th century. In Silicon Valley, which has helped, as my friend Astra Taylor and her great work, including the new issue of The Nation, which is about tech and inequality, mostly written by women and edited by Astra and her friend. And in her book, The People's Platform, has really done a lot to increase inequality. And that's part of the tragedy of the Bay Area now, is that a place that was so committed to radical politics, progressive, democratic, inclusive, egalitarian stuff is being not just being taken over, but taken over by an oligarchy of libertarian elitists. You know, but then, you know, but then there's always the Kickstarter guillotine and the rising up against and the Edward Snowdens and et cetera. You know, it's such a volatile era.
What I've thought about a lot lately is that after Occupy, there was such an immense, crushing response to the resistance, that there was such a long period before there was a lot of public resistance. Last year was an exceptional year for that.
You mean after Occupy?
After the Occupy movement, because there were
Yeah.
so many restrictions placed on public space, there are so many
Yeah.
restrictions happening around protests. There are right now.
I know we're long before then, and they started creating this sort of free speech cattle pens, the First Amendment cattle pens long ago, I think in the Bush era, or maybe before, and things like that. And, the Seattle WTO, early in before the Bush era, they basically decided that the First Amendment was like not going to make it to the 21st century. So, but so many things came out of Occupy. Strike Debt came out of Occupy. Occupy Sandy, which has been this incredible disaster relief and solidarity organization. Elizabeth Warren, in some ways, comes out of it. So you see these like extremely mainstream, student loan reform, the Homeowners Bill of Rights in California that Kamala Harris pushed, and stuff. And then one of the things that my work has always really been about is trying to describe the immeasurable and the unquantifiable. It's a lot of the sort of despondent left-wing narratives in this country come out of saying this, this happened and it didn't, we showed up today and the regime didn't fall the next day. They want sort of what I call instant results guaranteed or your money back politics. And often the consequences, like the Russian Revolution, as David Graeber describes it, which scared the daylights out of all the people in power in the rest of the global north and maybe a bit of the south. And and Occupy, I think, had huge positive consequences, so many of which are like deep and personal, where people just spoke up and found voice in community, and there are all these free clinics, people got their health conditions treated and stuff. And, it's so hard to quantify.
Well, I think the union movement in the liberal arts schools and the the adjunct unionizing effort is a product of the Occupy movement. I also think a lot of the resistance we saw last year with Black Lives Matter, post-Ferguson, post the Garner non-indictment, those are direct results of the Occupy movement. Black Lives Matter. There's also a technological component to that resistance as well, in terms of leveraging social media.
No, actually, I think people use social media in amazing ways, whether it's Facebook and Twitter in the Arab Spring, or Tiananmen Square in 1989 was the fax revolution. And people use whatever means they have. Email was used to organize the Seattle WTO 10 years after Tiananmen.
Yes, All Women. We talked a lot about Yes, All Women last year.
And I think that the technologies could be good things, but we've essentially allowed, just like the airwaves were privatized to the large extent with radio, we've allowed, this kind of other communication system to be largely privatized, run for profit, driven by advertising. It all looks free, but that's because you're what's being sold. In a way, you should all install Ghostery, which lets you see all the and then you have to turn off Ghostery so they're not tracking you, but because I'll track you too if you let them. But Ghostery lets you see every tracker, and you realize that Google is actually tracking you on probably 9/10 of every web page you ever look at, and they're compiling all of that data, which should make you feel all warm inside.
Somebody is watching. So great.
Yeah, you're popular. They're interested in you. You're not boring. No, people are interested in you. They want to know more about you.
Well, there was an exciting victory this week with Snowden's the verdict in relation to compiling data. And I know that we both attended the Electronic Frontier Foundation Pioneer Awards last year to look at some examples of people who are pushing back. And actually, I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you use to sort of evade that technology surveillance apparatus. Share the information with everyone.
No, I was talking to my friend Hugh Dandrade. Is Hugh here? Hugh Dandrade? I'm sure some of you know him, who works with Electronic Frontier Foundation, which tries to, sometimes gets kind of libertarian, but is protecting privacy, and mostly awesome. But there really needs to be workshops where, like, you get your new laptop and then you set it up so that you're minimizing the surveillance happening on it. You should all put a nice Band-Aid or a piece or a sticker over the all-seeing eye of Sauron on top of your laptop. because that can occasionally be turned on to watch you, or accidentally or otherwise. I use Ghostery, which allows you to turn off all the trackers on all the pages you look at. I use ad block. I haven't seen an ad in about 3 or 4 years, which makes life so much more beautiful. And I use DuckDuckGo, which is a search engine that doesn't track you. It's not as good as Google for some things, but then I switch over to Google and try and remember periodically to clear out, to try and get them to purge the sort of Stasi Kremlin files that they've compiled on me.
We have a few minutes, so we were debating about a question. Does anybody feel like they have a really good question?
Oh, see, we are elitists.
Oh, I don't know.
She's really got her hand
I
in there.
know. I saw
She's
some
taking
people
a selfie.
dislocate
Look
their
at that.
shoulders. Okay.
Any thoughts about Bernie Sanders? Wouldn't it be a beautiful thing if he won? And what's interesting is that people will say, oh, that's not possible, but it is possible. And Obama, whatever Obama turned out to be, the Obama campaign of 2008 was amazing. And it was one of those rare times when everybody voted for who they actually wanted, and even though it seemed like a long shot. And, it's like, and it's one of those things where it's like it was supposed to be an awesome turnout. And if poor people, people of color, and young people turn out, we're a really radical country. And if we just let, all the people who don't fit in those categories vote, we're a pretty conservative country. So I don't know. We'll see.
I have a question, and then I'll ask you a question, okay? I feel like it would be remiss to end this talk without asking you about the thing that I know that is closest to your heart, which is environment and environmentalism. And so I wondered if there was anything you wanted to say quickly about that.
Everybody in this room should be a climate activist in a very serious way. I do my best and work, in my writing, and I give a lot of money, not to Kickstarter guillotines, but to 350.org and other groups like that. And it impacts everything else. It's more important than, in a sense, it's more important than everything else, because everything else it's the sphere in which all life is enclosed, and all other causes, if the whole system collapsed, all these great noble causes within it do. So, and it's also one of those things where bad human rights things are terrible, but in 1,000 years, but we're doing damage that will last for 10,000 and 100,000 years, and sending things into extinction and breaking systems that are very old and very elegant. And we, among other things, we don't have that right. And the great thing is that when what we mostly need to do is stop the carbon barons, and when you do that, you actually make the world much more democratic, because these are some of the most corrosive forces in the world. If you democratize energy by which wind and solar are, and localize it, you take away, the Bush administration was basically an oil oligarchy running everything, and if we defund oil, then those forces are all bye-bye, which is
Defund everything.
Yeah. But so climate, just remember to be a climate activist.
Sir?
This is a somewhat counter question. Since you wrote about how nice people are to each other during disasters.
Yes, chuckle.
Well, no, I'm believing it. Do you think that it will require runaway climate change before we get economic democracy?
Let me just repeat that question. You mentioned how Rebecca has written about how people behaved so well in disasters and were so good to each other, and you wanted to know if it would require runaway environmental disaster, climate disaster to get economic democracy.
I don't believe that good things necessarily come out of bad things, and people often seize the opportunity. But what you really want is people who don't wait for the world to fall apart to be members of civil society and et cetera. I think that what really matters is changing the stories, creating the ability to recognize both the problems and the joys and pleasures. And, that we suffer a lot, and I talk about this a lot in a lot of places, from bad stories and lack of stories. And one of the things that was amazing for me about disasters was finding out how much the joy people take in being members of civil society and having voice and agency and meaningful work and a sense of community, and how much we don't talk about that as a basic human need. We only talk about private needs and bodily needs. And, so I don't think, and you can see there are cultures in which, and that stuff always exists to some extent. And I think disasters they bring an upheaval in which all kinds of things happen. Then I disagreed with Naomi Klein. I think that there's disaster capitalism. There's even more powerfully often disaster anti-capitalism. And you could see both at work in New Orleans in 2005 with Katrina, in Mexico City in 1985 with their earthquake. And
You mentioned some things recently about Nepal too, about different types of resources in Nepal.
I don't know what its political consequences will be, but it's funny because every time a disaster happens, people seem surprised by the amazing way people respond. But no, I don't think that. But it's also it's not like who's we, and good things will happen in, 7 billion people, or is it 8? We're going to get to different. It's not like we're all going to get there, and that's part of the kind of myth of the left, is that it's not good till everybody gets there, and it's not going to be that kind of winner take. We're not going to fix everything forever and then sit around in socialist bliss. And and it's also, climate change is very uneven. It's already making life unbearable in a lot of parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Islands in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean are going underwater. Some of the horrific weather they just had in Texas, and here we are in the Bay Area feeling kind of dry, but having a pretty mild time of it. So, wow, that's really gloomy. We have to say something upbeat,
I was going to switch to gun violence. Rebecca and I are both wearing Not One More bracelets. That was unplanned twinsies. And you recently wrote an amazing essay for The Guardian about the anniversary of the I Live As a massacre, and there were some really interesting strategies in your essay that I was hoping you would talk about.
What really came out, this bracelet was made by Christopher Martinez's father. He was this amazing 20-year-old, deeply beloved, lovely, brilliant kid who was going to go do public service law like his dad after finishing his English degree at UC Santa Barbara. And the killer who took 13 lives, was it 13? I'm feeling so confused.
I think he injured.
No, he said six other lives and then killed himself. He was just angry. He was full of cliches and entitlements. And I reread his autobiography, which was such a sad document of somebody who felt like they had no protection or immunities from all the stories we're told about what we're supposed to want and need, and what men deserve and what women owe men, and etc. And so he went on this rampage because he wasn't getting what the world owed him, and because having a gun made him an alpha male, which is bad evolutionary biology as well as not what guns do. And he shot Christopher Martinez, and it was an accident because he wasn't aiming or anything. It went straight into his heart, and he died on the floor of a fast food market as a young woman tried to give him CPR. And and it was such an interestingly horrible thing. It was partly about the proliferation of guns, and also the idea that violence makes you feel better, violence makes you somebody. The violence mostly that's committed on every mass shooting except one in the last 25 years is dudes. And and it was about the kind of poisonous of the culture. It was also about misogyny. He was most angry of all, and he intended to just do a massacre of the most beautiful sorority on campus because women weren't giving him what he thought they owed him and stuff. And so it was such a toxic thing. It gave rise to Yes All Women, the hashtag, which allowed a lot of women to discuss the violence and intimidation and misery they face daily. It actually created a new law in California where you can have a gun taken away from somebody who's mentally ill and potentially a threat to himself or others and things like that. But, Christopher Martinez is still dead, and his dad is still devastated. I spent Mother's Day with his uncle and dad.
Well, I know we're running short on time, and I know you wanted to leave it on an upbeat note, and I was thinking about how to switch from gun violence to being upbeat. And I'll tell you how I do it in my work. In my work, whenever anything happens, I look disastrous, like Isla Vista, like Nepal. I look to see how artists respond to things online. I look to social media, actually. And I look to people like you, Rebecca Solnit, so thank you so much for confronting all of these difficult subjects and doing it so well and so eloquently.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. And thank you, Christian.
Thank you very much.